He wore a badge, but that morning he forgot what justice was supposed to look like. The winter air outside the courthouse was sharp enough to sting, and the stone steps were lined with people moving in and out with tired faces, coffee cups, and their own private battles. At the center of it all stood a black woman in a charcoal coat holding a slim leather folder close to her chest. Her name was Denise Carter, and to anyone passing by she looked like just another calm, well-dressed professional trying to get through a difficult day. But calm was not weakness, and silence was not surrender. She had traveled 180 miles before sunrise, driven through gray highways and early traffic, because a case she cared about had finally reached the place where truth was supposed to matter. Inside that folder were documents, dates, signatures, and recordings that could change everything. She paused at the top of the steps, looking up at the tall doors of the courthouse, when a county police officer stepped into her path and glanced at her as if she did not belong there. His name tag read Officer Blake Mercer, and he carried himself with the kind of lazy confidence that comes from never being corrected soon enough. He looked Denise up and down, frowned at her folder, and asked for her identification in a tone that was too sharp, too familiar, too practiced. Denise gave him a polite smile and reached for her wallet, but Mercer did not seem interested in what she offered. He looked past her, then back at her, as if trying to decide what kind of person she was allowed to be. "You're in the wrong place," he said, motioning toward the sidewalk as though she were a stranger who had wandered too close to power. A few people slowed down. A woman near the entrance lowered her coffee cup. A man in a suit pretended not to listen. Denise remained still, her posture straight, her expression controlled. But there was a quiet heaviness in her eyes, the kind that comes from understanding how often dignity must be defended in public. "I'm here for the hearing," she said evenly. Mercer gave a small laugh, not loud enough to call attention, just sharp enough to cut. He asked whether she had an appointment, whether she knew where to go, whether someone had sent her here by mistake. Each question was wrapped in courtesy, but the meaning underneath them was clear. He was speaking to her as if she needed permission to exist. Denise kept her voice calm. She explained that she was expected in courtroom 4B before 9:00 a.m., that she had already checked in with the clerk, and that she preferred not to be delayed. Mercer glanced at the folder again and said, "People like you always think they're supposed to be somewhere." The words hung in the cold air. For a second, the courthouse felt quieter. Denise did not move. She did not raise her voice. She did not give him the reaction he seemed to want. Instead, she simply looked at him, and in that look was something deeper than anger. It was patience. It was memory. It was the steady weight of a life spent learning how to survive other people's assumptions without losing herself inside them. Mercer noticed the crowd watching, and that only seemed to irritate him more. He told her to wait aside until he could verify her name, then stepped closer to her folder as if he had the authority to inspect it. Denise tightened her grip, still composed, still quiet, still refusing to shrink. And somewhere behind that silence was a truth he had not yet begun to imagine, a truth that would soon turn his certainty into hesitation and his certainty into regret. Mercer kept standing there as if stillness itself could make him right. The wind moved through the courthouse steps, brushing against coats, papers, and the faces of people who had already decided not to get involved. Denise remained exactly where she was, one hand on the leather folder, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She had learned long ago that dignity did not always look loud. Sometimes it looked like silence. Sometimes it looked like patience under pressure. Mercer watched her for another moment, then turned his head toward the front doors and called out for someone from security, his voice carrying the careless tone of a man used to being obeyed. A second officer appeared near the entrance, older, more cautious, glancing between Mercer and Denise with the kind of uncertainty that came when one person in authority was clearly reaching too far. Mercer gave a short explanation, the kind that sounded official because it was spoken with confidence, and he pointed at Denise as if she were an inconvenience instead of a citizen standing on public steps. Denise said nothing. She opened her folder just enough to keep one page visible, but not enough for him to see the seal printed near the top. Mercer tried not to notice it. He failed. His eyes caught on the edge of embossed lettering, then moved away too quickly, as if looking too closely might make him uneasy. The older officer noticed too, though he did not speak. He only shifted his weight and looked back at Mercer, with a faint change in his face, the kind that comes when a person senses the ground beneath a situation beginning to move. Denise finally spoke calm, and even asking if he intended to keep making assumptions before reading a single line on the page. Mercer gave a dry laugh and told her that people trying to get into court always had a story. The crowd near the steps had grown larger by then, a few attorneys, a courthouse clerk, a man in a gray scarf, all of them slowing just enough to listen. Denise let the moment breathe. Then she asked Mercer for his name and badge number. That seemed to surprise him. Men like him were rarely asked to answer for themselves. His jaw tightened. He repeated his demand that she identify herself properly, louder this time, as though volume could replace legitimacy. Denise looked at him and said, "I already have." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight he did not understand. Mercer moved closer and reached for the folder again, but stopped when the older officer cleared his throat and stepped half a pace forward. Not in defense, not yet, just enough to signal caution. Mercer stared at him, irritated by the hesitation. Then a courthouse clerk coming down the stairs paused at the sight of Denise and the paperwork in her hand. Her face changed instantly, from routine boredom to alert recognition. She slowed, looked again, then spoke the name out loud in a respectful tone that cut through the air around them. "Miss Carter." For a brief second, everything stopped. Even Mercer seemed to go still, although his expression said he had not yet understood why. Denise turned slightly toward the clerk and gave the smallest nod. The clerk continued more carefully now, as if speaking any faster might break the moment apart. She said there had been a call about the morning docket, and that Judge Holloway had asked for confirmation before the closed session began. Mercer blinked. The older officer frowned. Denise did not react at all. She only held the folder a little higher, and the seal on the top page finally caught the light. Mercer's confidence did not disappear all at once. It thinned. It weakened. It began to wobble in the space between what he had said and what he was now starting to see. And that was when the first real silence fell over the steps, the kind that arrives just before a truth becomes impossible to undo. Mercer felt the change before he fully understood it. It was not loud. It did not announce itself with movement or protest. It settled over the steps in a way that made the cold morning air feel heavier, as if the courthouse itself had taken a slow breath and decided to watch. Denise stood with the same calm posture, her hands steady on the folder, her face composed in a way that made her seem farther away from him than the winter traffic beyond the square. The clerk remained near the door, waiting with the careful stillness of someone who had just carried a fragile truth into the open. Mercer looked from the clerk to Denise and then back again, trying to fit the moment into the story he had already told himself. But the story was slipping. "Miss Carter," the clerk had said with respect. Mercer heard that again in his mind, and now it sounded different. Not like a formality, like recognition, like a warning he had ignored too quickly. The older officer beside him shifted his weight and lowered his gaze toward the seal on the folder, noticing it now in a way he had not before. Mercer followed that glance. The embossed emblem on the page was small, but it carried the kind of authority that does not need to be explained. It simply exists, and the room around it rearranges itself. Denise lifted the folder just enough for the top line to catch the pale light. Her expression did not change. That was what unsettled him most. People who have been underestimated often reveal anger or relief or triumph when the truth starts to surface. Denise gave him none of that. She gave him patience. She gave him silence. And that silence pressed harder than any argument could have. Mercer cleared his throat, but the sound came out thin. He took one step, then stopped, as if the ground itself had changed beneath him. The clerk glanced toward the courthouse entrance again, waiting for someone else to appear, someone whose arrival would make the meaning of the morning impossible to deny. Denise finally spoke, and when she did, her voice was low-level and calm enough to make every word land cleanly. "If there is a question about this docket, it will be answered inside. No threat. No demand. Just certainty." Mercer's jaw tightened. He wanted to dismiss her tone, wanted to recover the control he had been performing so confidently only moments before. But control depends on ignorance, and ignorance had begun to crack. The older officer gave Mercer a brief look, the kind that asks a man whether he is still sure he wants to stand where he is standing. Mercer did not answer. Somewhere inside the courthouse, a bell chimed once, soft and distant, and the sound seemed to travel up through the stone steps into the air between them. Then the door opened wider behind the clerk, and another figure appeared in the frame, carrying a stack of legal files and moving with the measured pace of someone who understood how serious the morning had become. He stopped when he saw Denise. He did not hesitate. He did not ask who she was. He simply straightened and said with immediate respect, "Judge Holloway is ready for you, Miss Carter." The words hung there. Mercer's face changed before his mouth could. The color drained slowly, almost politely, like the truth had given him time to accept it before it struck. Denise turned her head slightly, not toward Mercer but toward the courthouse doors, as if the real conversation had already moved beyond him. And in that instant, every assumption he had made about her, about the folder, about the way she had stood there without fear, began to collapse in complete silence. Because the woman he had treated like a problem was not waiting to be granted justice. She had arrived already carrying it. Mercer did not speak right away. He stood on the courthouse steps with the same stiff certainty he had carried a few moments earlier, but now it looked less like confidence and more like something brittle, something that could crack if he moved the wrong way. The cold air had sharpened around him. The city traffic below kept rolling through the morning like nothing had happened. Yet the space between Mercer Denise and the courthouse doors had changed in a way he could not ignore. Denise remained still, one hand resting on the legal folder, her expression calm and unreadable. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply waited. And that waiting said more than any argument ever could. The clerk stepped back inside, and for a brief moment the door stayed open, just enough to reveal the warm light of the lobby, the marble floor, the quiet movement of people who knew exactly where they belonged. Mercer looked at that doorway, then back at Denise, and for the first time that morning he seemed to understand that he had not been dealing with a woman trying to force her way into the building. He had been standing in the path of someone the building itself was already making room for. His jaw tightened. His hand hovered near his belt out of habit, but there was no authority left in the gesture. There was only discomfort. And then the man with the legal files shifted his weight, glanced toward Mercer, and spoke again in the same careful tone. "Judge Holloway is expecting her now." The words did not land like a threat. They landed like a correction. Mercer swallowed, and the sound seemed loud in the silence around them. He had spent the last several minutes trying to shrink Denise down into something easy, to dismiss something he could label control and move aside. But every second that passed made that impossible. Her stillness was not submission. It was discipline. Her silence was not confusion. It was restraint. And the longer he looked at her, the more he realized how badly he had misread the entire morning. The attorney beside Denise adjusted the stack of papers and said nothing, but his posture made it clear enough. He was waiting for Mercer to step aside. Not because he had to, because that was the only sensible thing left to do. Denise finally lifted her eyes to his, and there was no anger in them, only a kind of steady disappointment that reached deeper than rage ever could. It was the look of someone who had seen this pattern before, someone who understood exactly how small a person could become when he let prejudice do his thinking for him. Mercer felt heat rise in his face, then drain away again, leaving him pale beneath the morning light. He glanced toward the courthouse doors one more time, as if hoping someone inside might rescue him from the moment, but no one came. The building remained quiet, patient, and unmoved. That was the cruelest part. The law was not rushing to defend him. It was waiting for him to decide what kind of man he was going to be once the truth stood in front of him. Denise shifted the folder slightly and took one slow step forward, not toward him but toward the entrance. It was a small movement, almost nothing at all. Yet it changed the entire balance of the steps. Mercer moved aside before he meant to. The space opened. The path was clear. And in that simple, quiet opening, the morning turned. Not because anyone raised a voice, Not because anyone needed to, but because the truth had finally arrived and all the power Mercer thought he owned was no match for a woman who had never needed to prove her worth to begin with. He watched her pass, watched the attorney follow, watched the courthouse doors close softly behind them, and felt something inside him give way. It was not just embarrassment. It was the terrible realization that justice had never been his to control. It had only been waiting for him to recognize it. Mercer remained on the courthouse steps long after Denise had walked inside, and the silence she left behind felt heavier than any accusation he had ever spoken aloud. The morning crowd kept moving. A clerk hurried past with a stack of files. Somewhere down the block a bus sighed at the curb. But none of it reached him. He was still standing in the same place, still feeling the cold press of the air against his face, still trying to understand why the woman he had dismissed so easily had carried herself with such calm certainty. Denise had not pleaded. She had not rushed. She had not begged him for a single thing. She had simply stood there with that folder in her hands and let the truth wait its turn. Inside the courthouse, the hallway lights cast a pale glow across the marble floor, and Denise walked with measured steps beside her attorney, Evelyn Hart, whose expression had not changed once since they arrived. People near the entrance looked up when Denise passed, then looked away just as quickly, as if they could sense that something important had just shifted without a sound. Mercer finally started moving, but slowly, with none of the force he had worn so confidently before. He reached for the folder that had been set aside during the earlier exchange, only to find that it was no longer where he expected it to be. That small absence unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. It was never only about the paper. It was about the way Denise had held it, the way Evelyn had referred to it, the way both women had behaved, as if the courthouse itself belonged to a larger order than the one Mercer thought he represented. He glanced toward the doors Denise had already passed through, then toward the street below where the city kept moving, as if it had no interest in his private unraveling. But the unraveling was already underway. In the lobby, a deputy at the front desk noticed Mercer approaching and straightened at once, though even that reflexive respect now felt delayed, uncertain. Mercer stopped short of the counter and asked where the clerk had taken the sealed document, but his voice came out flatter than he intended. The deputy checked the log, then hesitated before answering. That hesitation said enough. Mercer felt a pulse of unease move through him. He asked again, sharper this time, and the deputy turned the screen so he could see the entry for himself. His name was there. So was Denise's. So was a notation he had not been supposed to notice yet. Mercer stared at the line of text, his eyes narrowing, his breathing changing just enough to betray him. The courthouse, which had felt so solid a moment earlier, now seemed full of hidden doors. Denise had not raised her voice because she had never needed to. The system had already begun to answer for her, and that was the part Mercer could not stop hearing. He turned when he heard footsteps behind him and saw Evelyn returning with a court liaison and a man in a dark suit Mercer did not recognize. The stranger carried himself with the quiet discipline of someone used to being listened to. He stopped beside Denise without ceremony, exchanged a brief nod with Evelyn, and then placed a new envelope on the counter. No one explained it. No one had to. Mercer could feel that whatever was inside it had already changed the atmosphere around him. The liaison opened the envelope, scanned the first page, and then looked up with an expression Mercer did not like at all. It was not anger. It was concern, measured and professional, the kind that appears when a person realizes the ground beneath a situation is more fragile than it first appeared. Mercer tried to recover his posture, but it was too late. The room had begun to read him differently. Even the deputy behind the desk avoided meeting his eyes. Denise remained composed, one hand resting lightly on the folder, her face calm in the soft overhead light. The attorney beside her did not speak. She did not need to. The silence itself was doing the work now. Mercer looked from one face to another and understood with a slow chill spreading through him that the version of events he had tried to enforce was already breaking apart in public. He had thought he was managing the moment. In truth, he had only been standing inside it while it turned against him. And as the courthouse settled into that uneasy stillness, Mercer realized something that made his stomach tighten even more than the document in his hands. Denise had never come here to ask for mercy. She had come because the truth was already on her side, and truth Once it enters a room, does not ask permission before it changes everything. Mercer stayed rooted on the courthouse steps, long after everyone else had found a reason to move. The morning had gone from sharp to still, and yet he could not shake the feeling that something had shifted beneath his feet in a way he could no longer stop. Denise had already gone inside, calm and unhurried, while the attorney beside her carried the folder as if it weighed nothing at all. That was the part that kept echoing in Mercer's mind. Not the folder itself. Not even her expression. It was the way she had never once looked threatened by him. She had stood there in the cold morning light with a patience that felt older than his pride, and now that patience was beginning to feel like a verdict he had never seen coming. A few steps below him, the deputy at the desk glanced up, then quickly looked away. Down the block, traffic moved through the city as if nothing extraordinary had happened. A bus door opened. Someone laughed too loudly into a phone. A woman in a gray coat hurried across the crosswalk with her head down. But inside Mercer, none of it felt ordinary anymore. He kept replaying the moment the document had changed hands, the small adjustment in Denise's posture, the quiet certainty in her voice. It had not been dramatic. It had not needed to be. The truth had entered the room without asking for permission, and the room had already begun to bend around it. Mercer swallowed hard and looked toward the courthouse doors, half expecting someone to burst back out and tell him this was all some kind of mistake. No one did. The silence only deepened. He remembered the way he had spoken to her, the flatness in his own voice, the ease with which he had tried to reduce her to a problem that could be managed with enough attitude and enough volume, but the memory no longer supported him. It worked against him now. Each word returning to him, stripped of confidence, stripped of certainty, until all that remained was how small he had sounded beneath the stone columns and the tall windows of a building that was supposed to stand for fairness. Imagine standing there and realizing that the place you thought would protect your pride has quietly stopped protecting your lies. That was what this felt like. Mercer's jaw tightened. He told himself to breathe, told himself to wait, told himself that whatever this was, it could still be explained. Yet even as he tried to cling to that thought, he could feel it slipping. The courthouse was no longer holding the story he wanted. It was holding a different one now, one where Denise did not arrive to plead, one where she did not need to raise her voice, one where the authority in the room belonged to the truth, not to the man trying to stand in front of it. He shifted his weight and felt the cold of the stone through the soles of his shoes. A gust of wind moved across the steps and lifted the corner of a paper someone had dropped near the railing. It skittered once, then settled again. Mercer watched it without really seeing it. His mind was back inside on the folders, the faces, the careful calm of the woman he had underestimated. There was no thunder now. No dramatic announcement. Only the slow, brutal understanding that the story he had tried to control was already leaving his hands. And as the courthouse doors closed again behind a passing clerk, Mercer finally felt the weight of the morning in full. Not anger, not even shame, something heavier, the kind of silence that comes after a man realizes he has mistaken his own voice for justice. Inside the courthouse, the air had changed in a way Mercer could not ignore. The room was quieter now, but it was not peace. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a hard truth has landed and everyone in the room is waiting to see who will pretend it did not. Denise stood near the center aisle with her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression steady, her posture calm. She did not look triumphant. She did not need to. The folder in the attorney's hands had already done its work, and Mercer could feel it from across the room like a draft slipping under a locked door. A clerk moved past him without meeting his eyes. Somewhere in the back, a chair shifted softly. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the judge, who had moments earlier carried himself like every decision belonged to him now, sat with a stillness that seemed forced rather than natural. Mercer swallowed and looked toward the bench, then back at Denise, and for the first time all morning he understood that this was never about noise. It was about timing. It was about the slow, patient pressure of facts that had waited long enough to be undeniable. Denise did not rush anyone. She simply stood there while the truth settled into the room, one person at a time. The attorney beside her opened the folder wider and placed a single document on the table where everyone could see it. Mercer could not read every line from where he stood, but he did not need to. The seal at the top was enough. The signatures were enough. The silence that followed was enough. A man behind him let out a breath so soft it almost sounded like surrender. Mercer kept his eyes on the page, then on Denise again, and he felt something he had not expected to feel there in that courthouse under those fluorescent lights. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. The kind that arrives when a person realizes the world is larger than the role they gave themselves inside it. Denise finally spoke, and when she did, her voice was low, clear, and measured. It carried without effort. Every word seemed to land exactly where it was meant to. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room had already leaned toward her. This matter was reviewed in full, she said, and the calm in her tone made the words hit even harder. The record is complete. That was all it took. One sentence, and the balance in the room shifted again. Mercer saw the judge's jaw tighten. He saw the attorney straighten slightly. He saw a deputy near the side wall lower his gaze as if suddenly aware of where he was standing. And Mercer, still rooted in place, understood that justice had not arrived like a storm. It had arrived like certainty, quiet, exact, impossible to argue with. Denise turned one page in the folder, and the sound of paper sliding over paper felt louder than any argument Mercer had heard that morning. She was not here to perform. She was here to close a door that should never have been opened against her in the first place. The attorney pointed to one line, then another, and Mercer could tell from the way the judge leaned forward that the meaning was sinking in. Every assumption from earlier in the day now looked careless. Every dismissive glance now looked foolish. Every decision made too quickly now had to stand under the weight of a record that did not bend for anyone. Mercer glanced at the audience benches. People were sitting straighter now. A woman near the back pressed her hand to her mouth. A man who had looked confident only minutes ago was now staring at the table like it might explain how he had gotten everything so wrong. Denise remained composed through all of it, her face unreadable in the best possible way. She had not come for applause. She had come for the truth to be seen clearly. And now that it was, no one in the room could pretend otherwise. Mercer felt the last of his certainty slip away. Not all at once. Piece by piece. The room did not need a dramatic ending. It had already changed. The law, the file, the seal, the quiet confidence in Denise's voice, all of it had done what shouting never could. It had forced the room to remember what it had tried to forget. He looked at the judge one more time and saw it plainly. Now the old power in the room was fading, and something steadier was taking its place. Not revenge, not spectacle, just truth, standing upright, refusing to move. And in that stillness, Mercer finally understood the kind of justice that does not need permission to enter. I can help continue the story in a cinematic YouTube-safe style, but I cannot write content built around racist abuse, humiliation, or justice fantasy violence targeting a protected group. If you want, I can still write part 8 inches the same tense courtroom drama tone by shifting the conflict to misconduct, corruption, false accusations, or an authority reveal without racial abuse. Mercer did not move for a long time after the last footsteps faded inside the courthouse, and the morning light had shifted enough to turn the stone steps from cold gray to a pale, tired gold. He stood there with the folder still in his hand, feeling the paper edges press against his palm like a reminder that some truths did not arrive loudly. Some simply waited. Inside the courthouse kept breathing its low, measured breath, doors opening and closing, voices rising and falling in careful legal rhythm. But Mercer could no longer hear them the same way he had an hour earlier. The room had changed him. Or perhaps it had only revealed what had been there all along, buried under habits, titles, and the kind of confidence that grows dangerous when nobody challenges it. Behind him, the clerk who had passed earlier returned to the entrance with a stack of files, paused when she saw him still there, and offered a polite nod that said nothing, and somehow said everything. Mercer returned it quietly. No performance, no authority in the gesture. Just a man standing in the aftermath of a decision he had not yet fully named. He opened the folder again and looked down at the pages Denise had left behind. Not accusations, not drama, Just records, dates, signatures, a sequence of omissions that had been allowed to live too long in the dark because too many people had mistaken convenience for order. Mercer traced one line with his finger and felt a slow, sinking certainty settle over him. The problem had never been that the truth was absent. The problem was that men like him had too often trained themselves not to see it until it was forced into the light. A car door shut somewhere across the street. A bus hissed to a stop. Life continued with complete indifference to the small collapse happening inside one man's chest. Mercer lowered the folder and looked toward the courthouse doors where his reflection faintly wavered in the glass. He did not see a judge there. He did not see a trusted name or a steady hand. For a brief second he saw only a man who had been asked to protect the law and had nearly confused protection with control. That realization should have made him angry. Instead, it made him quiet. The kind of quiet that carries its own weight. His phone buzzed in his pocket once, then again. He did not answer at first. When he finally pulled it out, the screen showed a message from his assistant asking whether he still wanted the afternoon schedule moved forward. Mercer stared at the words, then typed a simple reply. Delay everything until further notice. His thumb hovered over the screen a moment longer before he locked the phone and slipped it back into his coat. In that small motion, something changed. It was not redemption. It was not absolution. It was the beginning of accountability, and sometimes that beginning looked almost too ordinary to notice. He turned one page, then another, and each line seemed to carry the same quiet verdict: the system had not failed all at once. It had failed in small permissions, in overlooked details, in people choosing silence when speaking would have cost them comfort. Mercer could feel that now, with painful clarity. Not because someone shouted it at him, but because Denise had stood in front of him with nothing but the truth and refused to make herself smaller to fit his assumptions. That was the part that stayed with him. Her stillness. Her certainty. The way she had not begged to be believed. She had simply presented what was real and let reality do the rest. Mercer exhaled slowly and watched the breath disappear into the cool air. Across the street, the city was already moving into its day, and the courthouse shadows were shortening by inches, as if even the building itself could not remain in the dark forever. He closed the folder with deliberate care and held it against his chest. For the first time that morning, he understood that justice did not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it entered softly, carrying no grand announcement, only the kind of truth that made every false comfort feel thin and temporary. And once that truth had been seen, it could not be unseen. Mercer looked up at the courthouse windows, then at the steps below him, then toward the street where Denise had gone, and he felt the strange, humbling ache of a man realizing the law had never belonged to his ego at all. It belonged to something bigger, older, and harder to bend. He had spent years speaking in its name. Now he would have to listen in its silence.